If you want to turn in your Bibles, we'll just for momentarily be in Genesis 8. The boat has been floating now for quite some time. The rain has stopped, the waters are going down. Probably not fast enough for the folks on board. But in January, which is in the Hebrew Tebeth, the ark is dry docked in a harbor perhaps 16,000 feet high. So they're high and finally dry. They would still be above most of the mountains on the earth even when the thing came to rest. They would have been above Mount Blanc, 15,781 feet, Pikes Peak, 14,180 feet, Mount Whitney, 14,502 feet, and the Matterhorn, 14,780 feet. So they're down now, but they're going to have quite a little weight because things have to go down to where they can maneuver and get around. You remember just before they landed, a raven is sent to reconnoiter. And unlike Poe's domesticated version, who perched on Pallas above the chamber door, Noah's caws nevermore, and it is really nevermore because he just takes off and doesn't come back. But the dove comes back, type of the Holy Spirit. And then you see that Noah waited on God in verse 13. He waited. We need to wait. You could be making spiritual applications all the way through here. We don't have time to do a lot of that. Be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. So he's going to do that. In a sense, he becomes like Adam. And he's a type of Adam in probably 12 or 15 different particulars. We're going to really be going today, but he had a testimony. It was a sweet savor that wafted to God. The testimony involved an altar or gathering at a church service, and that historically is sweet smelling to God. He had to contend with sin, even though now there were only 8, and they left that filthy world behind and the earth took a bath. It's still dirty. It's still dirty because man's on it, and anything man has to do with is going to be dirty because he's a sinful person by his very nature. All have sinned, and that was true here too. All right, he's a preacher of righteousness and so forth. Now we're to chapter 9. According to tradition, Noah descended to the base of Ararat and decided the general area, once the waters had gone down, looked pretty good. It had all of the amenities requisite and enjoyable home site, and so he settles there. He built a home. He kept enough livestock from the ark to supply the larder and would soon try his hand at tending to the old forbidden fruit, or at least what I think was the forbidden fruit, and that is the grapes or wine, no longer a sin. Things look pretty good. No enemies, no inequities, no IRS. They look good to him. He could forge his own future. His boys also staked out farms in the general area, and they were determined to carve out a quality life in the new world. And it is a new world with some new rules. I told you we were going to hop, skip, and jump and be in a hurry here. Chapter 10. Chapter 10, we'll slow down a little bit. Table of Nations. Now, the Table of Nations is an area skipped by most Bible teachers, unless you're in a college or something, and we're going to have to basically skip it. But it is very valuable if you want to make a study of it. It lets you know where the races came from, where they generally settled, and why there are racial differences today. And if you have your handout and you want to take a look at it, you'll see we have something in there that indicates the basic directions that folks took after the Tower of Babel. Basically, if you really want to simplify it, Shem went east. Ham went south. And Japheth went northwest. And then, of course, there are many different lines that come from them, representing the different nations. And even the study of Germany, where a lot of the Japhethites wound up. If you study those Germanic tribes, they all are traceable back to Noah, but it's a very, very intricate and difficult study. Now, this chapter is castigated. It is seen as fancy. It is seen as mythical. Some moderns don't like the conclusions they're forced to if this is real history, but it is. It is real history. And even many secular historians have said that it's an unbelievable chapter. And the more that they find out, and the more that they dig up, the more accurate it appears. It was dismissed for centuries as a fantasy, but every archaeological discovery has corroborated this table of nations. This table is, and I'm quoting from a secular historian now who was not saved, there is nothing in any other ancient writing discovered by archaeologists which is at all comparable in scope and accuracy. Now that was his take on the whole thing. There's nothing else out there like it. And even folks who don't believe the Bible, when the subject of race comes up, they say, well, all we have is Genesis chapter 10, so take a look at that. It may not be literal, but take a look at it. Yeah, it's literal. The table of nations. We could spend a year, literally, studying Genesis chapter 10 and tracing all these down. I think when I taught Genesis some years ago at TBT, we spent probably 8 or 10 weeks on this one chapter, but we can't afford to do that, of course. All right, let me plunge on here. They get together, as you know. They don't want to spread out. Man has this tendency to want to get together and centralize things. And God does not want things centralized until He wants them centralized. He does not want one leader until the leader is someone that God chooses or God Himself. But man got together. And when he got together, the worst came out. And you'll find in your Bible the words go to. Go to. Man gets together and he gets big ideas when he gets together. The English gives the idea of a supercilious egotism, which is undoubtedly the case. These folks were humanistic, teleological polytheists. Their goal was world conquest and a managed society, a society dependent on whoever was the head, and that was not God. It wasn't a theocracy. Go to and do what? Go to and build a city and a tower. A city and a tower. I don't know what's up back here, but pretty soon you'll see it. It will come up. The city and the tower. Now what you see represented today is probably not exactly what they had then. They kept building it and kept building it and kept building it until it became the marvel of the earth. But originally it was probably just the tower which came first. But the city is Babylon. Babylon. Gate of God. According to Herodotus, this thing was no little village, by the way. According to Herodotus, Babylon was 54 miles in circuit. So if you were going to go around the outside, you would travel 54 miles. It had a moat on the inner side of the outer wall. The wall was, hard to imagine, 335 feet high, 85 feet wide. And even as it got toward the top, it is said that at the top, 7 chariots could race around the top of this thing abreast. This is according to the biblical world, which is considered to be kind of the final authority on this thing. Now, as you entered into the main gate, you were on Processional Way, which was the main artery of Babylon, and many a victory march has taken place there down through the centuries. The city housed 43 temples. The original and central temple was the tower. Even the name is interesting, Babel. Babel. What do you say when you're not making any sense? You babble, like an idiot. Now the tower was actually a ziggurat. Now a ziggurat, I don't know if I spelled this right in my own notes, but it's Ziggurat. Somehow, for some reason, reflects the stars. And all kinds of wild theories have been advanced as to what is reflected and what does this mean. There's just about as much guessing going on here as there is when you're discussing the pyramid, the Great Pyramid. Every angle in the thing is supposed to mean something and set a date for something, and people have speculated for thousands of years on that. The original name was E-Temen-An-Ha. E-Temen-An-Ka. It's a huge mass of mud brick set in layers of bitumen and matting with an outer shell of baked brick, according to Biblical World, page 131. The base of this thing was 300 feet square. The height was probably about 30 stories, or 300 feet. And that's as high as they could go. That would have been, of course, for a long time, the highest structure on the earth. Pfeiffer, in his commentary, says 295 feet high. But this thing was impressive for the time. And they wanted to build a tower that would actually reach God, reach heaven. Now, I don't think, as smart as they were to be able to build this city in the tower, they thought that a 30-story structure is going to reach heaven. And I think it meant something else, something like, okay, we're going to not be dependent on heaven anymore. They had an obsession with height. Why? Well, they had just, within memory at least, survived a flood. What do you do when you fear floodwaters? You seek higher ground. And therefore they decided to build something so high that if God sent another flood, they would still be on top of it. They would be out of the reach of God, which is what man really tries to do today. A lot of this is kind of almost Freudian stuff. A tower that would reach into heaven. And there were also cosmological changes after the flood. The earth was changed. The mountain ranges were different. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers that went through the Garden of Eden probably aren't in the same place today as they were at this time. Now, there's a disagreement on whether this was a misguided attempt to contact God, or they were actually trying to overthrow or negate God And as I've said, I believe the negation was really what was going on here. At any rate, evil resulted. When man gets together, evil results. He thinks that he is progressing. Favorite word in the English language, progression, progressivism. And it really turns out to be regressivism. Evil resulted. They set up an elaborate liturgy, vestiges of which still remain today. You want to know where some of this is? I would direct you overseas. I would direct you to a city on 7 hills if you want to see some of the remaining vestiges here of what went on just after the flood. If you get a hold of Hislop's book, The Two Babylons, he traces a lot of this down for you. A class of priests was developed to lead the ignorant masses. A method of reaching heaven by human genius or effort was devised. See, for reference today, the sacramental system of the Roman Catholic Church. What you see today in the elaborate ceremony of men bowing to men and ring kissing and all that is going on is actually jazzed up Neo-Babylonian Nimrodianism. It's still going on, and we need to still be aware of it. And I know now people are trying to say, well, they're Christians too. We all are on the same page. We're all fighting the Muslims, or we're all fighting this, that, or the other thing. They believe much of what we believe, and they do. But how much poison does it take in order to kill you? Beware a religion, quote, arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abomination and filthiness of her fornication, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Where do you find that? Revelation 17, verses 1 through 6. So it's still here. It comes right down through the centuries. It never went away. All right, the Babel confusion. One language, one place, one polity, one goal, one religion, one name, one economy, one sanctuary, and one leader. In short, they accomplished the kind of cooperative, unified, upward giant leap for mankind that liberals crave for modern society. They had it. They had it. It has happened before. They're trying to make it happen again. They've tried many times down through the centuries. It's never worked out because it won't work out until the Lord of glory comes down, sets up shop in Jerusalem, and rules the earth. In verse 5 of Genesis 11, and the Lord came down to see the city. The Lord came down to see the city. Very deterministic verse. The Lord is controlling things and kind of pulling the plugs here when he wants to, and doing what he wants to do and affecting what's going on down on the earth. And the crux of the dilemma here is the degree of determinism. When does the Lord determine what is going to happen? With what regularity does God intervene or interfere, as if he doesn't have the right, in the evolving structure of society? I remember my meeting with my faculty advisor as he was sending me out the door. I'd completed the classwork at Missouri State University for my master's degree, and then he was sending me out to write the thesis. I had to meet with him and a bunch of criteria I had to meet. And as I got to the door, he said, "Bartlett," I stopped, "one more thing." I said, "What?" He said, "Leave God out of it." Leave God out of it. To the secular historians, the concept of an active, involved deity is the interpretive fallacy that they call the joker in the deck. God is the joker in the deck. So leave him out of it. You don't need him. You can play the game without the joker. Now, the other extreme is God wills every act of man and nations to the point that we almost become mindless robots. God determines who's going to eventually make it and who isn't. God determines everything that happens on the earth. He's behind it. We are robots, and it's kind of a galactic chess game of fatalism. It reminds you of the old woman who was a hyper-Calvinist who fell down the stairs. She dusted herself off and said, "Thank heavens that's over." Everything is determined. And I'll admit there's no pat answer. I'll concede that the degree of determinism, the regularity, the intensity, and the directness of the intervention has fluctuated. It's fluctuated with the different dispensations. But as a working generalization, I would write this down: God intervenes whenever his decree is threatened. God intervenes whenever his decree, his plan, that's the technical name for his overall plan of the ages, whenever the major tenets of his plan are threatened, the thing is liable to go awry, he moves in and he does something to keep it on track. And here it was in danger of going awry. There was universal corruption. Man was together and the outcome could not be good. Now, come down to see bothers some folks. God came down to see. And of course, we've told you many times that this is an anthropomorphism. An anthropomorphism, if you're taking notes. Anthropo, man, morph, change form. God takes on the form, but not literally here, of a man, although he can, and at that point it's called a theophany. But man takes on the form of, or is described in terms that you would use as if God was a man to facilitate understanding. The attribution of some of his traits into the form of men so that we can understand it. The seeing of the nefarious activity that is down there, he sees it. What does that mean when God sees it? It means he took judicial cognizance of it. Judicial cognizance. If he is forced to act, he recognized what was going on and he began to act. God is omnipresent, of course, we know that. All right, let me skip ahead a little bit here. All right, they got down, they got unified, which is what they want. Unity can be a good or a bad thing. It depends on what you're unifying around and what your goal is. It wasn't good here. Because nothing will be restrained from them when they get together. Anything that they can imagine, that they can form in their brains, they will attempt to do and be able to do much of it, and it won't be good. Nothing will be restrained from them. Lack of restraint. If you have no restraints at all, you have no authority. And no authority means rebellion or anarchy. There should be restraints. There has to be restraints in society. What kind of a mess would we have if everyone ignored red lights and green lights? What kind of a federal mess would that be? If you've ever driven in Europe, they almost do that. They just go when they want to go. And it's a mess. Everyone needs a fixed authority, or there will be rebellion. Everyone needs order and responsibility and accountability. And this involves even the home. A disordered home is a home where there is not a lot of authority, to where even, say, a 7 or 8 or 9 or 10-year-old kid can kind of direct things because he has no discipline, because there's not a hand that can come down at some time that is maybe compassionate but consistent. Their imagination is the limit, and they're off. That's why the brain of man, the imagination, is corrupt. The restraints are the evidence of love. What is the evidence of love? That you do what is best for the loved object, that you will sacrifice for the loved object, that you will do things that are not comfortable for the loved object. It's not hugs and kisses. That's not necessarily, oh, look how much he loves his kid. He hugs and kisses him all the time. Yeah, but the kid can run wild. That's not love, that's selfishness. When you really analyze it, it's selfishness. You just want to feel good, and you want the kid to feel good about you, so you don't discipline him. It's not flowery speech. If you love them, you'll take judicial cognizance of what they're doing. In our house, I don't have time to get into this, but in our house, you couldn't say, well, this is my room, it's my territory, stay out, don't look in my drawers, don't look in my closet, it's my room. My parents, hey, it's their house. Your room happens to be in my house, therefore I can go through your drawers. I want to know what's going on at all times. I want to know what you're up to. And because of that, I want to put some constraints on you. All right, there was a key guy in all of this who organized things, and his name was Nimrod. The confounding confusion was so great, the cooperative effort so nefarious, everything was undermined that God wanted for the earth. The exact timing of some of these things is not recorded. But at some point, and I used to portray it like this at BBC, I don't know if it's totally accurate. A little bit of this is my sanctified imagination. But they completed the tower. People gathered by the thousands by this time, because it had been a couple of hundred years probably since the flood. They gathered by the thousands to dedicate the tower. And then the head Gyrastacutum, Nimrod, he steps up and he is about to pronounce the dedicatory curse. And just about that time, he starts talking, and all Hades breaks loose. What he utters is what he thinks is his native tongue, but it sounds different to the different segments that are out in the audience. He steps up and he says something, and it sounds like pig Latin to someone else that is out there. And they think, what in the world, has our leader flipped his lid here? But someone else says, Der Führer, and someone else says, Quien sabe? And all over, these thousands of people started looking at one another like everybody has gone crazy. No orders can be issued, no orders obeyed. Fear and distrust spread like a prairie fire. Vituperative, incoherent rhubarbs erupt among the inhabitants of the city, who quickly gravitate to those of like tongue. Folks who are alike band together. It's just a drive. The government wants to drive them all apart and make every segment of society exactly like every other segment, but that's not what man wants. Man wants to get together with folks who are alike. In 2 or 3 days, groupings of thousands were seen winding out of the city, some headed east, some south, and some swinging north and northeast. It was a mess. Now, where do the different races come from? I'm going to read you a little bit here from Henry Morris. Now, Henry Morris was a scientist. I am not a scientist per se. I'm a sociologist, I guess, if you want to put it in secular terms. But most of what he says I agree with, not everything. As each family and tribal unit migrated away from Babel, not only did they each develop a distinctive culture, but also they each developed distinctive physical and biological characteristics. Since they could communicate with only members of their own family unit, there was no further possibility of marrying outside the family. Now, the pools for each of these groups that left this area were pretty small. Hence, it was necessary to establish new families composed of very close relatives for several generations at least. It is well established genetically that variations take place very quickly in a small inbred population, but only very slowly in a large interbreeding population. In the latter, only the dominant genes will find common expression in the outward physical characteristics of the population, reflecting more or less average characteristics, even though the genetic factors for specific distinctive characteristics are latent. Don't worry about that, it's a little bit technical. In the gene pool of the population. In a small population, however, the particular suit of genes that may be present in its members, though recessive, in the larger populations will have opportunity to become openly expressed and even dominant under these circumstances. Thus, in a very few generations of such inbreeding distinctive characteristics, now here's the gist of it, characteristics of skin color, height, hair texture, facial features, temperament, environmental adjustment, and others come to be associated with particular tribes and nations. And that is his boiled down explanation of where the different races come from. I agree with some of it at least. Babel, the last memory the various groupings had in common was fleeing from this confusion that was on the plain of Shinar. A new deal, new frontier, great society, Camelot, almost was. They had it going. But that mean old God came down and messed it up. And in a sense, that is a microcosm of how they feel about Christianity today. We are messing things up. We could just really be progressing if we could just get rid of those fundamentalist conservatives. Things would be swimming down here. And man would spend the next 4,500 years trying, perhaps in an almost Freudian fashion, to recapture the lost dream that seemed within their grasp as far back as the tower. Maybe trying to reestablish Eden even. Paradise lost, paradise regained. His last shared memory was of incoherent gushing from the lips of fellow citizens. Babel, B-A-B-E-L, a lot of folks spell it L-E. Babel is an example of the English literary device called onomatopoeia, the word imitating the phenomenon. To talk confusingly, to talk incoherently, is to babble. A brook that seems to make no sense is a babbling brook. Genesis 11. For approximately 2 centuries after the Babel dispersion, nothing concrete is given beyond the connecting chain of names leading to the first of the great patriarchs. We'll move through the patriarchs, and we'll move quickly through them as well. I suppose the most outstanding thing physically that happened during this time was the loss of longevity. The loss of longevity. life expectancy. It drops. It drops dramatically. Noah, having come along and lived a lot of his life before the flood, nearly matches his forebears. He lives to 950 years. But Shem drops to 600. The figure called Arphaxad to 438. Selah to 433, about half the previous expectancy. At Peleg, a similar loss occurs as he and his immediate successors top out at 239, 239, and 230. So things are changing. The age of parents changes, drops proportionately here. They have babies much younger than they did previously. Selah has a son at 30, Eber at 34, Peleg at 30, Ru at 32, Serug at 20, Nahor has Terah at 29. First child at those ages, that's almost normal. Or Gloria had, I guess I didn't have him. But our first child at 27, I was 27 years of age. So you can see it's just about normal pretty quickly here. This precipitous drop over a short period is obviously the result of something. It's the result of the altered cosmology due to the flood. What changed? A lot of water. How did a lot of water change that? Now, Morris, in his book, The Genesis Flood, and you ought to get it. I mean, it presents a young earth that I don't necessarily agree with, but you ought to get it because he has a lot of good material in it. He says there was a vapor above the earth, and that the harmful rays of the sun are the things that cause aging. Even folks that spend a lot of time in the sun today, they tend to have their skin shrivel up and age. But that was all filtered out by this vapor that was around the earth, this canopy. It's actually called the canopy theory. And waters came from everywhere. They came from the canopy above, they came from the great deep. They just arose everywhere during the great flood, which is where all the water came from. But after the flood, the canopy was depleted. And these harmful rays then were not filtered out, but hit the earth and its inhabitants, and therefore caused them to die rather quickly by comparison. The vapor canopy had been depleted. Genetic and somatic, that is, body cell mutations, would have increased, and folks started dying much quicker than they had. Okay, as you look at these figures, let's pick out another one here. Terah was born in 2126 BC. Terah. He died in 1921 BC. He was 70 when he begot Nahor, not Abram, Nahor. There's no statement concerning Abram's birth. Abram then was born probably, according to the experts, in 1996 BC when Terah was 130, making him 75 when his daddy dies at 205. Now, in the era of the rule of God on earth with a chosen people, you'd have to say it began in 1996 BC. The rule of God on earth with a chosen people, because he is the father of the Jews, with a chosen people. It began in 1996 BC. The Bible, after a period of broad tracing and historical framework, now makes a decree that we're going to get on the road toward this Genesis 3:15 fruition here, which is Jesus Christ appearing on the earth. The plot now clears up quite a bit, and you can begin to trace things. Genesis 12. Now God will inaugurate a process that modern sociologists and anthropologists have a hard time swallowing. And what is that? He discriminates. He discriminates. That is, he picks out one guy and says, okay, not worried about the rest right now. I'm going to work through you. Discrimination used to be a good thing. So-and-so, it just means to mark a difference, okay? To discriminate, to mark a difference. If you don't discriminate between a red light and a green light, you can be in trouble. Someone who is discriminating is someone who weighs things, sees things, and makes a logical reaction to what he sees. He's discriminating. The post-Diluvian world proved almost as rebellious and wicked as the antediluvian. Even after the dispersion, they continued to emphasize, for instance, the host of heaven. The host of heaven. And the host of heaven is not God and the angels. Now, some tried to include Jehovah in the process. A few tried to remain pure. Job and Melchizedek, for instance. They tried to retain purity, but their percentage was so small that there seemed an imminent danger of the unencumbered, unadorned theology, worship, knowledge of the true God vanishing from the earth. Just by way of analogy, around, I'd say 1890 to 1920, conservative theology, fundamentalism, literalism, almost perished from the earth again. And there was a fundamentalist movement and a revolt in the Northern and Southern Baptist conventions and other groups that actually saved it. A come-outist phenomenon occurred. My voice is going here. It doesn't hurt. If you're looking at me like he must be hurting, it doesn't hurt, it's just going, that's all. Now the Lord said unto Abram, God is in the calling and picking and choosing business. He picked some for blessing, some for service. It wasn't the Apostle Paul who said that he was blessed because God put me into the ministry. He called him out. He put Paul into the ministry, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12. He does this after testing and discriminating, looking and seeing whether this person deserves at all to be elevated. Why should I pick him out of the whole mass? But God, being God, has the right to do that. I like to play golf. You can take 14 clubs with you in a round of golf. You look at the shot, you evaluate, and you think, okay, I think this shot calls for a 6-iron. You reach into your bag, you pull one out, pull a 6-iron. But the 8-iron doesn't say, hey, why didn't you pick me? Because I have the right as the owner of the clubs to look at things and make a decision and choose the iron I want that I think will do the job. God has the same prerogative. And he looks and he pulls out Abraham out of the bag here, or Abram at this time. And he said to Abram, not to anyone else, I got a job for you. But that job I have for you involves getting you out of this country. Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house. Well, maybe he was a homebody. Maybe he didn't want to get out. There have been a lot of folks that God calls, I think, but they won't leave mama and papa. They won't leave the home city. They won't go for preparation. It's just too painful, and they're not going to do it. They're not going to uproot. Acquiescence to the will of God isn't always easy. The will of God may require divesting of some things and separating from some things and depriving yourself of some things. Extreme personal sacrifice. Well, to just kind of cut through it here, eventually he does leave. Doesn't leave immediately, and he doesn't go immediately where we would think he should have gone, but he does leave. But he takes with him someone that he wasn't ordered to take. Who was that? Help me. His nephew. He takes nephew Lot with him. Who else pulled a stunt like that? Help me. Moses took Aaron. I don't talk too well. I need Aaron to come along and talk. And that was a drag on the process, but the Lord let him do it. So he takes Lot with him. I want you to go into a land that I will show thee. I will go into a land that I will show you. Well, what, Lord, are you going to do there? How are we going to get there, Lord? Lord, what this, what that? The Lord doesn't always tell you. He just says, hey, go. And I'll direct you when you're en route. Go. And I know a couple of characters that didn't do what I think God called them, and they later said they thought God called them as well because they couldn't see the end at the beginning. You can mess up doing that. Unto a land. Now the land that they're going to eventually wind out at turns out to be occupied by a people who are cursed. It's not going to be a very pleasant situation. He didn't tell them to go to Hawaii. People who are cursed. A people who are uncultured compared to where he was up in Mesopotamia. People who are dangerous to live with. And I will make of thee a great nation. Of course, we know that's the Jews today. Actually, several nations come from it, but the one he's referring to is his people. When a definite promise is made, look, and you know it's God. I think everything I read, everything I know, I've prayed about it. God wants me to do this, I believe. Man, you better do it. You better claim it at that point. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And of course, the Jews have been a blessing. Yeah, I know they've been a problem too, because they're enemies of the gospel, but they have been a blessing as well. Let me move forward here a bit. So Abram departed, takes Lot as excess baggage, doesn't do it exactly by the numbers. It's kind of the same application that we made when we were discussing the ark. Just do it by the specifications that God gave. Exactly. Because when that wave comes along, I want it to be God's plan and not my plan at that point. How many of you know the name Stuart Hamlin? Anybody know that? Who is that? Stuart Hamlin. All right, Stuart Hamlin was into country music. Pardon? Hamlin. Stuart Hamlin. He wrote the song that used to be a very popular song in Christian circles called It Is No Secret. It is no secret what God can do, what he's done for others, he'll do for you. Well, Stuart was into country music, and he made quite a bit of money. He had a string of racehorses. And he would take those around, and there wasn't a good atmosphere, really. And he decided God wanted him to get rid of them. So he got rid of his string of racehorses, but he kept one favorite horse. And Bob Jones Sr. told him, Stuart, if you don't get rid of that last horse and make a total break from your old life, pretty soon you're going to be right back where you were. But he kept that one horse. And pretty soon he was right back where he was. You follow the orders explicitly, exactly, just as they're given. Abram was 75 years old. 75 years old. And he marries him a wife who's a little bit younger than he is. Sarai is 10 years younger. A girl at, we'll say 15 to 24 or 5, can be beautiful, but hardly glamorous. Glamour or class takes a little maturing. This girl that he married, this Sarai, and that's still pretty young for this time. She's 65. That's young? Yeah, for this time that's pretty young, because they're going to live to almost 200 still. She's the it girl of the generation. She is exceedingly beautiful. Back when I was teaching this, I used to say she was the Liz Taylor of her day. Liz is dead. I don't know who to compare it to now. Beauty can be a curse, though, can it? And we're going to find that her beauty is going to be a curse to this family. In chapter 12, verses 6 through 9, they journey from Haran, where they stop, to Shechem, a little under 400 miles distance from where they were. Shechem is north of Shiloh, in the geographical center of Palestine. So that's the goal. Get into the absolute center of God's will. They're there. And I guess that means everything's going to be hunky-dory at that point, because you're in the center of God's will. Name it and claim it. No, things can still go wrong. Maybe God wants you to suffer. Maybe he wants you to be a testimony. The center of God's will. And the Canaanite was in the land. The Canaanite was in the land. The Canaanite is the other side, the enemy. That group that is going to fight you. The Canaanite. There is a war with foot soldiers on either side. And that war is going on today. And the land of Canaan and the history of Canaan, what Ruckman calls the dirty piece of dirt, is where a lot of this is being fought. Canaan is out of bounds, Genesis chapter 10. So what does the devil do? He knows it's going to be fought right here, so he puts his big guns into this area in order to keep God's people out. God says, I want my people there. Therefore, I'm going to start to move them there, and you're going to establish the beachhead, Abram. Well, who are the big guns that the devil moves in? The Anakim, and Rephaim, and Zuzims, and Nephilim, and Emims. Deuteronomy 2, verses 10 through 20. They're entrenched there. Now, who are they? I think we've mentioned them before. They're descendants of the giants. And they're not as big as the original giants were, but they've commingled with mankind, and they're still giants. They're going to scare the children of Israel off. But we're like grasshoppers in our own sight. Compared to these giants, we don't want to go into the land. They're there. And they scare the wits out of Israel for years and years. If the Lord wants you in the wilderness, he'll keep you in the wilderness. If the Lord wants you in the land, even if there are giants there, it'll be better with the giants than it is in the wilderness, because that's where he wants you. And the Lord appeared. Then the Lord appeared. This is the first actual appearance of God in Scripture stated as such, a direct theophany. Now by this time, Abram has sizable flocks. On his trek down there and the places he stops, he is and I don't want to say something that's politically incorrect here, but he is a good father of the Jews. He is successful monetarily. And that is reflected in flocks. That's money on the hoof. Flocks. And he has a sizable flock as he moves. His nomadic existence, he moves wherever the moving is good, wherever the money making is good, the grazing, the water, the ideal area to increase his livestock. He avoids the inhabitants of the land, and he moves around. But a famine comes in the land, and it threatens his flocks. So what's he going to do? He's going to go south. South all the way to Egypt. Now, Egypt is the world. There's trouble down in Egypt, but he has to go. It's better than seeing his flocks die, his animals die. But he's got a problem. Now, what is his problem? Some of the men will identify with this. Oh, my wife just walked in. Problem is his wife. She's just too stinking good looking. That's going to be the problem. And she's different. She comes from 700 miles to the north, which means she is more Japhethic than Hamitic, which means she is light-skinned. Men seem to gravitate to a difference, and there's a difference here now. And he sees, as he's going down there, all of these folks, all of these males gathering in groups, looking at his wife, and then whispering to one another. And he knows, oh, I've got a problem here. I've got a problem here. They're liable to kill me in order to get her. And they would have. So he devises a plan. And what is the plan? He gets his wife aside and says, look, we have a problem. He says you're a fair woman. Now what does that mean? By the way, don't tell your wife you're fair. But in the Bible, that means really good looking, okay? He had a fair wife. But Scripture says a couple of verses later, she was very fair. Don't underestimate your wife either. But you're good looking enough that we're going to have to run a ruse here a little bit. We're going to tell everybody you're my sister. You're not my wife, you're my sister. Was that a lie? Well, it was a half-truth. She was his half-sister, but also his wife. So what happens? Come back next week.